Hello again, Grown Black Folks Talk, supplemental to the previous video. Different types of men outside the common paradigm. That once you understand the common shared American paradigm is failing, and you have to step outside of that to vet men successfully, some things to look for. Now, the previous video is 44 minutes. This will not be 44 minutes. I just want to talk about just some very basic things to look for, okay? If we have decided that the carbon copy, what my dad would call the Black Anglo Saxon, the carbon copy of the same kind of American man who still is making excuses for grinding people up in order to meet his American dream. If that's not what you want, and maybe that's why we can't vet these men, because in the United States of America, because of our reverence for our founding fathers, it is very difficult to vet a man for his degeneracy, because if we see the right works presented, we tend to let things slide. This is how George Washington could have a set of false teeth yanked from another human being live without anesthetic, and we don't let that slide. This is how Sally Hemings' suffering was let slide for 200 years, because we look at their works, and their works are their salvation. And I've told you this is based on bad American lip reading of theology, which is very much based on the idea that working is your salvation. Your existence is to work. And you work because, and this is, we're not even talking about what was done to the the enslaved. We're talking about what people now do to themselves, because only work has value. And why it's so hard for people to pull away from this, because of this bad, twisted theology that is very profitable for the types of people who would still have us working without sufficient pay. How do we know this? Because this is what's going on. So, if a man's goal is to want to come to the top of that system and basically become the carbon copy of people that supposedly we are fighting against, then maybe that's what we need to vet for. Because the reason that some of these men cannot be vetted is because inside that paradigm, you can be as messed up as you want to be, as long as you present good work. Now, when it doesn't get you what it's supposed to get you, then you can deal with aggrieved entitlement that you then take out on Black women. That's a lot of what's going on. Because we're not talking about even the Pookies and the Ray Rays. We're talking about the so-called good guys at this point. And I went into that in detail, and also left a link to FD signifiers dissecting the manosphere, which goes to very deep levels talking about this. Now I want to move on to, okay, men that are somewhat outside the box. Let me start what I know about the best. My father and my grandfather, actually both my grandfathers, were classic Black male provider men. And of course, those kind of men are more rare now. But perhaps you've not thought about why that is. My father was born in 1936. And in the 1930s, because of the Great Depression, uh, a philosophical argument that had been going on for the last 60 years was being settled in favor of a gentleman known as W.E.B. Dubois, who posited that Black people should accept that there was a talented test, meaning that 90% were not talented. So there was no point in even pursuing that. That only 10% were worth being educated, and they would lead the race to whatever at that point. Now I'm oversimplifying a lot, but I'll put this video in the description. His idea that education would be the Black man's salvation. And when he talked about education, he's talking about education in white people's schools. He's talking about receiving the knowledge back to the Greeks and the Romans. His ideological opponent, and these two men absolutely hated each other, was Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington said, no, we built this entire country. We don't need anything from them, because they don't have, America doesn't have anything that we didn't give them. And WBD, you wrote The Gift of Black Folk. You wrote The Souls of Black Folk. You agree with me, right? You wrote that. So you already agree. If we are the most gifted and talented, period, all of us, it's not the genius of just 10%. If everybody would buckle down, discover their skill level, stop comparing themselves to everybody else, and learn what is valuable and useful, the country still needs us. He said famously, integration, sure, the hand is integrated. See this? It's one thing. We can be as separate as the finger. We do not need to rub up on them and become a carbon copy of them. Booker T. Washington remembered something that W.B. Du Bois, who was just about it, maybe a little younger, forgot. When both of them were little boys, the culture that W.B. Du Bois wanted to get civil rights and rub up against and be totally integrated with, all mixed up together, would have sold either one of them for a few dollars to someone else, would have beat, raped, murdered those boys, to say nothing of the women. Again, this is the late 18th, early 19th centuries. We're still not really in the conversations with Black women like that, but I'm just saying. So Booker T. Washington actually remembered reality about this culture, about America. W.B. Du Bois somehow forgot, as smart as he was. He totally forgot about that. But by the 1930s, not George Washington Carver, he and Booker T. Washington were close friends. But Booker T. Washington had been, by 1936, Booker T. Washington had been dead for 20 years. And the educated, because it gave them a sense of power and purpose, began to take over the conversation. Now, if they had not taken over the conversation, we probably would not have civil rights as we know it today. But the legacy of this is that you raise a generation of men who are going to be dependent on another culture to give them value, another standard of living. And again, who is that standard coming from? Do y'all know that much about the Greek world? The Greek world is where we get the idea, not that a man should have multiple wives, but that he can have a primary wife and a whole bunch of male and female side chicks. That a man, once he reaches a certain amount of money in life, ought to be allowed to live like a Greek god. That's where that comes from. That's not how it was practiced in Africa. If you were in Africa and you had to prove that you wanted to be a polygamist, you had to prove to those women's fathers that you could provide for all of them. But the idea that these Black men who are out here want all kinds of women is a Greek idea, not the African idea. We're going to earn a certain amount of money, and then we can have access to whatever it is we want sexually. Pederasty and pedophilia, that's a Greek idea. And Erastus was a mature man. And he would literally, with his money, go to a poorer family who was struggling and buy that boy out for sex. He would make sure he got an education and he would pay for that family's expenses. But that was basically what happened. You ever wonder why pedophiles, especially in the Black community, will come out loud and tell you the manosphere has hosted men like this, talking about they target poor families? That's not African, that's Greek. And so the men who were raised on Dubois' philosophy, that first of all, we're going to be dependent on white men for our sense of who we're going to try to be, and that only 10% of us at any one time are worth it, that we're the prize, we're the prize. And that it's the responsibility of everybody else to raise my children, because for Dubois, the school was going to give them both their moral and intellectual development. Those are Dubois' men. My father and my grandfathers were classic Bookerites, whether they knew it or not. I don't know if they ever sat down and thought about it. But people who are of Mr. Washington's viewpoint believe very much that God gave them the talent necessary to support their family and the community without having to make reference to anybody else. And if they simply lean into that, they will be able to provide and protect sufficiently. And as Mr. Washington himself experienced, white men of the same mindset who are, quote, self, because they value self-reliance, they will work with you on that. Neither my father nor my grandfather had difficulties with racism to the extent that you would expect, given how talented they are. Now, look here. You living in Dubois' world, Mr. Dubois' world now, W.E.B. Dubois' world now, where a man gets a little piece of education, hasn't even graduated, about ready to go to law school, thinks he's the prize, he's talented now. You're living in his world now. But the prosperity that Black people enjoyed from the 1880s, 90s, noughts and teens of the early 20th century, Booker T. Washington gave you that. Let me show you something else. See, without having to be worried about whether the white man next door was doing this or that, Booker T. Washington's philosophy gave my family this. It is a God-centered self-reliance model in which you don't have to wait around on what everybody else is doing. You just do what God gave you to do and stop worrying about comparing yourself to everybody else. These men do well in American society, but they're not going to be out there competing and trying to impress everybody around them. And it works, ladies and gentlemen. Now, these men can be in any field. They also can be earners and investors. I mean, they can be earners, investors, or businessmen. They exist. But if you are someone who's concerned about comparing yourself with what white women have, and you feel like, well, other women have this, so should I. If that's your main goal, you're going to miss this kind of man because he's not concerned with that. He's going to make what he feels is necessary. This kind of man will provide you incredible security because he finds more purpose in making sure his family is cool and making sure his community is as cool as he can make it than he is in becoming that white man. So he is still an American in most of his ways, but he is now a subculture that is rare because W.E.B. Dubois won the argument. And that's one of the reasons we got the trouble that we have today. But these kind of men who are more self-reliant, these are the kind of people who would have listened to Booker T. Washington back at that time. And I've just shown you evidence. This works. We are the survivors of gentrification. And if you look around and you got to pay attention to who gets through that, you're going to find there's a trend. So the Bookerite is a subtype. He's outside the common paradigm now for Black men. But he's not whining and complaining. He's quiet. He gets his work done. He's not exciting. But my mom would tell you, my grandma would tell you, I never even met the grandfather who bought this house. Never even met him. But he was held in such honor. His widow outlived him by almost 40 years. And that was the grandmother that I knew best. The honor in which his wife and daughter held this man for 40 years, and my mom to this day. And my mom would tell you now, 42 years into marriage, these men take care of business. We wish we could get Dad to slow down just a little bit at this point, but that's not how men like this are wired. He's 85. He's gonna do what he wants to do what he feels necessary to secure his family till he just can't do it anymore. It is what it is. But this is also why, and he creates great value in his life, not because he's forced to do it, not because he's hoping for some kind of reward. It is his reward. He enjoys doing it. He has a great sense of purpose and value. He is respected by younger generations of different color men. He has the respect that Black men want as a man. This man is a king in his mixed, gentrified neighborhood. He is respected in the Black community as it exists still in the church community. This man is a king. And that's what Booker T. Washington's philosophy will get you in the end. Eventually, you will have to, it's because what you have chosen to work for is necessary that you work. But you're not working chasing down everybody else's idea of what you should be based on white standards. You do what you're called to do by the Lord, and you will reward it for it. And the reward is security, a sense of good sense of self. And yeah, usually some money comes along with it as well. Now, this man today is going to be also involved in working with other people in the 21st century economy, because that is the appropriate thing to do since no one else is going to come get you. A younger version of this man is going to be catching up on tech. A younger version of this man, that you can see these guys online. A lot of them are in crypto. They're not waiting on anybody else. They don't know it, but they're following Mr. Washington. Because the whole idea of you getting a traditional education is not even important to them, but they are even putting together courses for you to get involved in what they're doing. Just like Booker T. Washington built the Tuskegee Institute. There's Black men like this who are younger. You don't have to find one that's 85. But again, now, this particular channel, his name is Eli, What Happened to Common Sense, and he says he gets cursed out all the time, called all kinds of things, because he's not going to teach reliance on someone else, including the poor Black hustlers of today. But he provides world-class education in terms of how the 21st century economy actually works. So that's one type. Probably the easiest to find. If you are at a point where you're not willing to step totally away from the box, then get you a book of right, man, if you can. You have to, now you might have to actually study the book by books you watch and look at it up from slavery. Read it a couple of times till you understand it. Read it till you stop fighting with it in your head. You don't have to believe all of it, but understand it. Because those men are not going to be making a reference to everyone else and everything white men are doing. His goal is not to become a carbon copy white man. His goal is to become himself. And whatever woman goes with who he is authentically, that's who he's going to roll with. And that's kind of the key thing for us as Black women. Okay, so that's a common type. That's the one I know best because that's the men in my family. And that's most of the men that we hang around, actually. Most of the Black elders that are doing stuff in the Black community, of course, Dubois' ideas, there's some of them that are good. I'm not throwing him out entirely. Mr. Dubois has some good ideas. But if you look at how they roll, nah, we're going to get the folks together and we're going to take care, we're going to handle this. It's a very Booker Wright attitude. Okay. Now, stepping a little bit further outside the box, Mocha Mommy does a good video on the outdoorsman, and which I'm not going to break down. I'm going to link to that in the description. This is another good type of man to find. By the way, I should also mention, because if we're also looking outside the box of just looking at Black men, inside the Black community, the Washington Dubois debate frames this for the Black community. Outside the Black community, more of these men are in the conservative camp, but you just have to be really careful because that looks different in every community. White men, Latino men, Asian men can all be anti-Black racist. That's the one thing many of them can agree on, that Black people are a lower standard. But Asian and Latino men are going to kind of look at you in a slightly different way. Latino man, because he comes from a caste system, but he may be someone who was escaping that caste system. Possible. Asian men, because they're dominating Africa at this moment. But Asian men look down on Black people for a very specific reason. They feel that we're lazy. That an industrious Black woman is not going to have that kind of problem necessarily. But the question is, can you stop being the industrious Black woman to be respected? So you got to look out for different things. Most of these men are going to be conservative politically. My dad is much more conservative politically than average for Black men, but that's also due to age. But you'll find more of these men in other communities in the conservative camp. But they're not necessarily Trump conservatives, because Trump conservatives are extremely culturally dependent. So you're not looking for that. I think the term that I probably want to find for a Booker Wright man would also correspond in any other community to a paleo conservative, old style, minus, you gotta be careful about this, the racism. Okay, moving on. The whole class of outdoorsmen. He can show up in different ways. Golden Gate Park has some cute little landscapers, and they're generally in good shape. I mean, they may not be fashion model in shape. But the thing is, these are people that see the connection to creation as the most important thing. A lot of Black men take blue-collar outdoor jobs for this reason. And so there's variations of this in the city, because I've seen more in the city. There are also people who know how to live in the fields more, even to the point of being off the grid. You also find these men as traveling men who have the kind of job where now they could travel the country when they want to. And if you want to listen to these men, I want to see the country. And when you ask them, they're not talking about seeing the cities. They're talking about beautiful things that they've seen in creation. You find these traveling manifestations of this. These men are probably not going to be as interested in having the biggest house and the biggest car. These men are not interested in climbing the corporate ladder and becoming carbon copies, again, of the founding fathers. They value the freedom to get away from all this and to go to communion with the earth. You'll find them landscaping, gardening. And a lot of times we kind of overlook them, especially those of us who grew up in the city. We don't think about why is it the parks are beautiful? Why is it when you go to certain sides of town, the yards are beautiful? These are men skilled in the ways of nature. Another variation of this is the craftsman. A construction worker is not necessarily who I'm talking about, because a construction worker works to a set of plans. What I want to talk about is the person who does the kind of detailing, the person who does the architecture. The architect is another variation of this. The city planner is another variation, but definitely more indoors. But the type of man who values his time, this is also another variation of this man, is the slow liver. Now, there's a whole slow movement, slow food, slow, I mean, it goes to, it's almost to the point, slow church. It's almost to the point of being kind of its own subculture of itself. But this also may be the man who works a 9 to 5 job, but values walking home if there's a park on the way. This also typifies the kind of man who, if he has kind of mobile job or can work from home like I work and can pick hours, I meet these kind of men quite often because guess what? They're in the park. They're in the park. They do the work they have to do. They get back outside. Now, the artist, I'm not talking about the rapper. These men may hold any kind of position in American society. They may hold any kind of job. They may be an investor. They may be a businessman. Businessman in the early part of his career was younger, more rare because of what it requires to put a business together that works. But they don't look at getting a job, the next car, the next house as the key thing in life. They value fundamentals. Some are loners. And so they don't even care that much about the society, but they value living in harmony with the world as it exists, not the world system, but the world as it exists. They value being good stewards of creation, which by itself puts them outside of materialism. These are also men that are into things like free cycling. They will be recycling. They're going to be using creation well. These men will be concerned about the environment. They may not be to the point that they're counting every carbon point, but you can kind of watch the way they live. They're not going to overconsume because they recognize the relationship between that and pollution. Now, in the United States, again, this puts you outside the box. The farmer, of course, is in this class of individuals. He makes his living in communing with nature. But in the city, the gardener, the landscaper is in the same class of people. The man who takes time off multiple times a year to go, even to go hunting, to a point, this may not be the most attractive, but the man who knows how to live respectfully, I'm not talking about the trophy hunter, the beekeeper, mind you. I mentioned this because San Francisco has a beekeepers club and I'm thinking about going to check it out. The beekeeper, the husbandman, the man who knows how to work with creation to make a living. He's never going to put the pressure on money the same way because, again, he knows how to go to creation as it exists and provide a living. Now, I think for most of us, and I'll stop here, this should be enough to give you ideas. This is far enough outside the paradigm that most of us will be well outside our comfort zone. By the way, we're still inside the United States of America. We haven't even talked about, because they're Black content creators who are more, go talk to Stephanie Perry, go listen to Local Mommy. I'll put their channels in the description. I'm not qualified to talk about that. So I don't talk about what I'm not qualified to talk about. I will refer you to other people. Imagine then living somewhere where the things that I just mentioned that are outside the box of the United States of America are primary values, meaning that the majority of the men that you meet are going to value working in community with creation, being respectful of creation. Imagine living in a culture where that's just the way people live. But we'll stop at the door. For most people, most Black women, you may not go to the point that you could actually live off grid. That may be a long place for where you're stepping down. And all of these things, was a Bohemian Soul did an interview with Stephanie Perry. I'll see if I can find it. Talking about living in a tiny house. Most of us are urbanized enough in our thinking because of the way African Americans have lived for the past 50 years. So the real outdoorsman, that's a long step. That's a real adjustment. However, there are intermediate steps you can take. Even if so much as moving to a neighborhood where you can walk home to a park, that's an intermediate step. Most of us as Black women at this point, I would probably say, where are the Booker rights, the Booker right men who are going to be able to live inside urban society, but they're not going to be in love with it so much so they have to take it out on you. And he can be anywhere. He can work any kind of job. But I'm telling you now, he's going to have the least trouble adapting to the 21st century. This man will be well adapted. And if he is, he's not going to put a big strain on, okay, my present employment gives me worth, because that's not going to be it. He's going to be interested in growing and learning and keeping up. And keeping up because it's necessary for him to do that to maintain part of the economy. But he also may walk through the park. Being a person and being found. It's probably going to be easier to think of it in terms of looking at a man who's comfortable in society, but not trying to be a white man, who's comfortable with himself and his abilities and his skills. I should also say this, a Bookerite man today will probably not present himself that way. That argument's been over for 100 years. But he's going to be a tremendous problem solver. This is going to always be someone who walks in and can look at a situation and will go consult and go use his own research skills and his own abilities and will bring back a solution from here. Not by referencing how white people do. No. He will know those things because white people have solutions to certain things. Don't get me wrong. But he's not going to be looking at waiting on someone else to do it. This is the kind of man who's going to come in and get stuff done. And he's not going to be interested in doing this and expect to be patted on the shoulder. He's not going to be doing it. He's going to be looking at, how can we do this together? That's really important. So another way to look at this, where are problems being solved? Where are problems being solved? Now, generally, a whole lot of women are going to be solved in the Black community. But around the society, that's something else to look for. Where are men who get things done? Outdoorsmen, craftsmen, men plugged into the 21st century economy in a life-affirming way. And again, that nature piece is important. This is not a perfect, because again, we just discussed this concept yesterday. I just thought about all this last week about why we may be, missing in our vetting. So these are not complete concepts, but I'll put down some other things in the resource in the chat. You must be outside the box to be found outside the box. Again, you might want to examine yourself to see how much you want to be a carbon copy of a white woman and how much rubbing up against your white friends and fitting in with them is important to you. You might want to examine yourself when it comes to your children about how much you think everyone else is responsible for getting them to where they need to go and raising them. I have my mother homeschooled me, so we lived through 40 years of these conversations about, but the school has to do it. That's that poison from W.E.B. Dubois, or Dubois. That's that poison from there. How responsible are you as a person for yourself? And recognizing, and how comfortable are you recognizing that, yes, you do have the ability to solve your own problems. How comfortable are you with the idea that you want to start where you are, cast your bucket down where you are, Booker T. Washington, and be doing all the things that you can do, having the faith necessary to know you will find your circle of people. How comfortable are you with beginning to exit the box? Because when you get outside the box, there are some people that you will find. Now, when my parents were young, they were not as far outside the culture as they are today. So this is harder to do today than it was when I was born in 1981. They were already outside the common stream, but not that much. So will you necessarily be able to find men like this in the Black community? There are some left. But again, they're outside the box. They're not the Black men we sit up here and be arguing about all the time, talking about how this and how that. No, there are Black men who are outside the box too. And these men marry interracially for the same reasons. Not just because someone else is a preference, sometimes because they're looking for someone outside the box. You can actually find this online. You see this a lot. You know, black men who have enough money, but they're on a journey where they're traveling and doing things off the grid. It's more rare. It's more common to see a black woman with a white man who's doing this, but you do find it. It does happen. Because sometimes people are looking for, it's not that the man is lazy, it's just that he realizes that a lot of the stuff we were told was important is a crock. But one thing is for certain, if a man is worthy to be called by that name and given that respect, whatever situation you find him in, that you are found in, this man will not make excuses for doing what's necessary for you. Again, if you want to chase the American dream, he may not do that, but he will make sure that you are secure. And if you discover in yourself a love for nature, you discover a love of the outdoors, if you discover a love of being able to have a life where you spend a lot of time with him in nature and having a circle of people to do the same, he will provide that. Now, let's go back to my Book of Right Father, who is not as far outside the common stream as some of these other men I've described. You know, are we keeping up with the Joneses? You know, as my family bought a new car, a new phone, a new this? No, we never did that. Dad always buys quality things that last. We have some items that are functioning well there. He's still working with that are almost as old as I am. Quantity? No. My family's not interested in that. Quality? Yes. A man will be quality no matter where you find him if he's worthy of the day. He may not be interested in keeping you in the latest fashions because you can't hike in that anyway. But you're always going to have the best kind of hiking poles and the best shoes. A man like that, what does 50-50 look like if you on a road on RV? Alicia released, the artist, does a fine video with Stephanie Perry about this, where they roll their RV up by close enough to internet connection somewhere, did the work they had to do to make the money that they needed, and got back on the road. What does 50-50 look like when both of you are mobile and both of you are doing the work that you love and bringing money in and enjoying the process and supporting each other? A whole different paradigm. But you have to step outside the box yourself first. Not waiting on it. You have to become a Book of Right to this extent. You're not waiting on anybody else to pull you out of the box. You have to step outside the box here. And once you do that, then you begin to see men that are also outside the box. Still got to run the criminal records and all the rest of it. We're not going to, you know, all the other things I've said about men, you got to do. But where are these men? What are they doing? I've given you some ideas. I'll put some other things in the description for you so that you can begin to kind of think in terms of maybe we can't vet people in the same box we're in that's failing. But what's it going to look like outside and where do maybe you find these type of men? All right, that's enough. I'm trying to keep it from being 44 minutes. Y'all have a good day now. Goodbye. Okay, where is the stop button? I've been doing this long enough. Hold on. Bye, y'all.